I'm not suggesting Queen Camilla lacks authority, but that tiara isn't hers. It rightfully belongs to Catherine, the Princess of Wales, for the Christmas gala at Buckingham,
The sound of keys hitting the table changed everything. Princess Anne had arrived expecting a tense discussion, but within minutes, she was holding control over rooms Camilla believed she could still secure. What followed was not a symbolic disagreement or another carefully managed royal misunderstanding. It was a direct intervention inside Balmoral itself, and the moment Anne closed her hand around those keys, everyone present understood that an invisible boundary within the family had finally been crossed. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Balmoral Castle carried a weight beyond stone walls, because its private family suites preserved the memories of Queen Elizabeth II and generations before her. Within this dramatized story, those rooms were not simply unused chambers. They were emotional ground, protected by grief and an unspoken belief that some parts of royal life should never be rearranged casually. Camilla had instructed staff to relock several restricted suites, but Anne intervened before the order could be carried out. She demanded the master access keys and took custody of them herself, turning a household instruction into an unmistakable family confrontation. The Queen Consort felt the challenge immediately. What hurt was not merely losing control of the keys, it was the way the princess treated the decision as something that could not be negotiated. A senior household aide had warned Anne earlier that morning that locks were being checked and access permissions were about to change. She had not stumbled into the dispute. No one challenged her then. She came prepared, already convinced that a line was about to be crossed, and the moment she entered the room, her controlled anger made it clear that she intended to stop it. Anne placed the collected keys on the table and separated one older brass key from the newer copies. Her fingers rested on it before she looked toward Camilla and said that no further lock changes would happen until she had spoken directly with Charles. The gesture carried more force than shouting could have. The king's involvement now became unavoidable because the dispute had moved beyond household management and into the emotional territory of his late mother's private world. Camilla remained still, but the silence around her hardened. Her original reason for sealing those suites had not yet been explained, and that missing motive changed everything. Anne may have stopped the doors from being locked, but behind the order was a fear that reached far beyond one corridor, and directly into the memory of the woman who once ruled Balmoral. For Anne, Balmoral was never simply another royal property. It was childhood, duty, grief, and the last fragile traces of a mother whose presence still seemed embedded in its quiet rooms. For Camilla, however, the castle represented something entirely different. The difficult task of occupying a royal world built long before she entered it. Now those two emotional realities had collided, and neither woman was prepared to surrender the meaning she believed the castle carried. Anne carried the argument with her long after the keys had changed hands. She had spent a lifetime knowing Balmoral as a place where public duty briefly gave way to family memory, and that made the disputed suites intensely personal. The rooms connected to Queen Elizabeth were not ceremonial spaces in her mind. They held traces of routines, private conversations, and the final years of a mother whose absence still shaped the family. Changing access without speaking to those closest to her felt cold, almost clinical. Camilla felt something very different. As Charles's wife, she expected to have a practical voice in how occupied and restricted areas were managed when the king was in residence. Restricted suites, in simple terms, were private rooms where access could be limited for security, preservation, or family reasons. To her, managing those spaces was part of keeping the household functioning. Yet Anne's intervention had made that authority feel suddenly fragile. Camilla sat with a senior aide after the confrontation, and removed her glasses slowly. She admitted that being overruled in front of household staff had hurt more than she expected. The queen consort could tolerate disagreement, but this had felt like something sharper. A message that when certain parts of Balmoral were involved, her judgment would always come second to a history she had not shared. The aide hesitated before reminding her of one troubling detail. Anne had not simply demanded general access. She had named 3 suites specifically. That meant the princess knew exactly which doors were being targeted before she entered the dispute. Camilla immediately understood the implication. Someone inside the household had warned her, and whoever had done it clearly believed the lock changes were serious enough to trigger direct family intervention. Anne already knew why one room mattered most. Personal effects from the previous reign remained inside, largely untouched, turning the disagreement into far more than a question of keys or household control. The objects carried memory, and memory carried ownership of a different kind. Suddenly, Camilla's attempt to regulate access looked to the princess like a decision about who was allowed to protect the queen's private legacy. That left one dangerous question hanging between them. Someone had first suggested those particular rooms should be sealed, and the instruction had reached Camilla before Anne knew anything officially. To understand why the keys became weapons in a family struggle, the story had to return to the private incident that turned quiet discomfort into open resistance. The crisis did not begin beside a locked door. It began days earlier, over breakfast, when one seemingly ordinary question about unused rooms caused the entire table to fall silent. Camilla had asked why several private suites remained preserved when almost nobody entered them anymore. Anne's reaction was immediate, but she said very little. That silence mattered. Because from that morning onward, everyone close to the family sensed that Balmoral was no longer merely preserving history, it was dividing the living. Camilla had raised what sounded like a practical question, but the timing gave it weight. Several rooms connected to Queen Elizabeth still remained largely untouched, and the family had never fully agreed whether they should be preserved exactly as they were, carefully catalogued, or gradually returned to ordinary household use. Controlled access simply meant limiting who could enter while inventories, security checks, and maintenance were carried out. To the queen consort, that sounded orderly. To Anne, it sounded like the first step toward changing something the family had not emotionally finished grieving. Charles had avoided forcing a final solution because he understood the danger. Balmoral carried different memories for everyone, and the king knew a decision that looked sensible on paper could feel brutal inside the family. Camilla asked whether the late queen's adjoining dressing suite and 2 private rooms should finally be placed under controlled access so the work could begin. Anne looked directly at her and answered with sudden clarity. They are family spaces, not spare rooms. Camilla heard more than disagreement in those words. She felt the old boundary rise again, the sense that she could live inside this royal world, help manage it, even stand beside the monarch, yet still be reminded that some emotional territory had existed before her and might never fully accept her. The queen consort remained composed, but the remark stayed with her because it made the issue feel personal rather than practical. Anne pushed her untouched cup away and stood before breakfast had ended. Later, she found Charles alone and told him that some boundaries should never require written rules because family should already understand them. The princess was not asking for a policy. She was asking her brother to recognize that altering access to their mother's rooms without direct family agreement would wound people long before it solved any household problem. Days passed, but the argument did not disappear. Anne then learned that maintenance staff had been instructed to inspect locks on the same suites discussed at breakfast. Worse, she discovered Camilla had requested a formal list showing who possessed duplicate keys. The princess interpreted that immediately as preparation to tighten control. By the time Anne and Camilla faced each other again, Neither woman was arguing about maintenance anymore. They were fighting over who possessed the moral right to decide what happened inside the Queen's private world. The breakfast had exposed the wound, but beside those disputed doors, restraint was about to disappear. There were no photographers, no ceremonial smiles, and no staff conversation loud enough to disguise what was happening. Anne stood opposite Camilla in a Balmoral passageway, while a small ring of keys remained between them. Neither woman raised her voice at first. That made the moment more dangerous. One believed she was protecting the dignity of the past. The other believed she was being challenged in the present. And suddenly, the argument became brutally simple. Who would control the door? Anne had already confirmed that several locks had been inspected, but not permanently replaced. That narrow gap mattered, because once new access arrangements were completed, reversing them would become far harder without a direct family decision. The master keys were being held temporarily during the review, meaning the central set capable of opening the restricted rooms had not yet disappeared into permanent security control. She knew exactly what that meant, and she arrived before the window closed. Camilla refused to step back from her reasoning. She told Anne that preservation could not mean freezing an entire part of Balmoral forever, especially when maintenance, security, and household responsibilities still had to continue. The Queen Consort believed she was defending order. The princess heard something else. She replied that efficiency did not give anyone the right to erase emotional boundaries that had existed long before this dispute began. Anne moved closer and extended her hand. "Give me the keys." No aide stood between them. No official softened the words, and no one pretended this was still a routine discussion. Camilla remained motionless for several long seconds. Then she placed the ring down instead of putting it into Anne's hand. The gesture was controlled, but the message was unmistakable. She would surrender access under pressure, not acceptance. Anne picked up the ring and immediately noticed something wrong. One key was missing. She checked the others once, then looked directly at Camilla and asked which room it belonged to. The question changed the tension at once, because now the argument was no longer only about preventing future lock changes. Something had already moved beyond her reach. Camilla finally admitted that the missing key had been transferred to the household security office because its suite was considered the most sensitive. The office was simply the part of the royal household responsible for safeguarding access, emergency entry, and protected areas. To the Queen Consort, the transfer proved that the matter had already entered formal procedure. To Anne, it raised a far more dangerous question. Anne closed her hand around the remaining keys, but her anger had shifted. Camilla was no longer the only person she wanted answers from. Someone had authorized that transfer, and if Charles knew about it, then the conflict had just become much bigger. She had won possession of most of the keys, but real power did not sit in her hand. It rested with the one person whose silence could either validate her intervention or destroy it. When Charles finally received the account of what had happened, he did not respond immediately. He read the household note once, then again, and placed it flat against the desk. His wife had issued an instruction. His sister had stopped it, and somewhere beneath the procedural language sat something far more painful. The private spaces of their mother had become the battlefield. The king could avoid the argument for another hour, perhaps another day, but he could no longer avoid choosing what those rooms meant. Charles understood that Anne holding the keys had changed the immediate situation, but not the final one. Balmoral's household arrangements ultimately rested under the sovereign's direction, meaning the monarch had the authority to approve or stop changes to access, security, and private use. The princess could prevent a lock from being changed today. She could not decide forever who entered those rooms, unless her brother stood behind her. Charles also knew what either choice would cost. If he backed Camilla without qualification, Anne would see it as proof that emotional history had been pushed aside for convenience. If he backed his sister completely, The queen consort would feel humiliated after trying to carry out what she believed was a practical responsibility. The king was caught between a wife asking to be treated as part of the present and a sibling defending memories built across an entire lifetime. Anne entered without ceremony when he finally asked to see her alone. Charles looked at the keys in her hand before asking whether taking them had truly been necessary. She did not become defensive. The princess answered quietly that someone had to stop the process before a temporary review became an irreversible decision. Her restraint unsettled him more than anger would have, because she was no longer fighting only over locks. She was asking him to protect something they had both lost. Charles then gave her the detail that changed the entire argument. He had never ordered the suites to be sealed permanently. The king had approved only an assessment of preservation, security, and household use. A review meant to determine what needed protection and what could eventually be reopened or managed differently. Camilla had taken that authority further, interpreting the review as permission to tighten access while the work was underway. Anne listened without interrupting. That distinction mattered, but it did not erase what had happened. Camilla had not tried to seize Balmoral, yet her decision had crossed a boundary the princess believed should have required direct family consent. Charles now had to say that clearly enough to stop the dispute without making his wife appear reckless. Charles reached for a fresh page and began preparing a written clarification. Every word would matter. It would determine whether Anne's intervention became official protection or temporary defiance, and whether Camilla retained any influence over the rooms she had tried to secure. The king's clarification would end the uncertainty, but it would also force his wife to confront the possibility that his sister had won. The decision arrived without ceremony. No family gathering, no dramatic proclamation. Just a short written instruction placed before Camilla, stating that the private suites would remain under restricted family preservation arrangements, and that no locks were to be altered without direct approval from Charles. She read it twice. Then the room went completely still. What Anne had seized physically, the king had now protected formally. And for Camilla, that distinction offered very little comfort. Camilla understood the meaning immediately. Charles had frozen every proposed change and ordered an inventory review before any future decision about access or use could be made. An inventory review was simply a careful record of what remained inside the rooms, what required protection, and what could eventually be handled differently. Until that process ended, the disputed suites would stay exactly as they were. The king had chosen caution, and that choice placed a clear limit on his wife's earlier instruction. Camilla folded the page once and set it beside her untouched tea. She asked her aide to cancel the planned walkthrough of the affected wing, then sat without speaking for several moments. The queen consort had believed she was carrying out a practical extension of the earlier review. Now the written clarification told her that interpretation would not stand. What wounded her most was not losing a procedural argument. It was realizing that Anne's intervention had forced Charles to draw a boundary around her authority. Anne, meanwhile, was temporarily allowed to keep the working family keys while the security office retained the master emergency copy. The arrangement mattered because it prevented any immediate lock changes without placing permanent ownership in the princess's hands. She had stopped the process, but she had not seized control forever. Even so, the decision confirmed that her alarm had been taken seriously. Staff soon learned that a separate list of preserved belongings was being prepared. The information moved quietly, but its meaning was powerful. These rooms did not hold only furniture or unused possessions. They contained items that had rarely been discussed outside the closest family circle, and the disagreement over access had suddenly exposed just how much emotional history remained behind those doors. Anne discovered that one sealed suite contained handwritten notes, family photographs, and small personal belongings associated with Queen Elizabeth's final years at Balmoral. The anger she had carried began to change. What had felt like a battle over control now felt painfully intimate, because every object reminded her that the woman at the center of the dispute was no longer there to decide anything herself. Anne no longer wanted another argument. She wanted Charles. Not the sovereign, not the final authority, but the brother who had lost the same mother. After days of fighting over keys and permission, the conflict was about to become painfully human when the two of them entered one of those preserved rooms alone. For the first time since the dispute began, there was no Camilla, no household official, and no argument about procedure. Only Anne and Charles stood inside the room everyone had been fighting over. The air carried the strange stillness of a space preserved after someone has gone. Suddenly the keys mattered less. The locks mattered less. What remained was memory, and two aging children confronting the uncomfortable truth that protecting the past can become another way of refusing to lose it. Anne turned the key only after Charles had personally approved the visit. That mattered. Earlier, possession of the keys had represented resistance and control. Now the same act carried permission, trust, and grief. The principal private suite remained largely preserved, with personal belongings still where they had been left, and both siblings understood at once why ordinary household management could never fully explain the meaning of the room. Anne felt her anger begin to collapse into something more painful. She admitted that part of her fury had never really been about locks. It came from fear. Every small change, every object moved, every room repurposed, felt like another piece of their mother disappearing. The princess knew grief could not stop time, but she also feared that practical decisions made too quickly would turn memory into inventory before the family had learned how to live without the woman behind it. Charles reached for a familiar personal object and held it without speaking. The silence stretched. Then the king told his sister that preserving everything forever was impossible, but changing everything quickly would be equally wrong. He understood now that delay was not necessarily weakness. Sometimes it was the only way to give grief enough room to settle before permanent choices were made. Anne then asked the question she had avoided since taking the keys. Had Camilla actually understood what was inside these rooms when she ordered tighter access? Charles did not answer immediately. When he finally did, the truth altered the shape of the conflict. The queen consort had been working mostly from household and security summaries, written briefings explaining access risks, maintenance concerns, and preservation needs. No one had fully conveyed the emotional significance of the belongings left behind. Anne absorbed that quietly. It did not erase the mistake, and it did not make her regret intervening. But it removed something darker from the story she had been telling herself. Camilla had not knowingly tried to erase Queen Elizabeth's private world. She had acted without understanding the full weight of what she was touching. Charles looked at his sister, and neither needed to defend the past anymore. The confrontation had created a villain and a defender, but what Anne learned behind the locked door made that simple story impossible to maintain. And once that truth escaped the room, the entire meaning of the Balmoral battle was about to change. By morning, the argument over a handful of keys had escaped Balmoral's walls and become something much larger. To the public, those keys were no longer pieces of metal. They represented memory, succession, belonging, and the uneasy question of who gets to reshape the private world left behind by a monarch. Anne's intervention was celebrated by some as loyalty to her mother. Camilla's supporters saw something different, another moment in which she was judged against a past she could never replace. Palace communications moved quickly to cool the reaction. Officials described the matter as an internal review of preserved family spaces, rather than a constitutional dispute, meaning it had no direct effect on the legal structure or succession of the monarchy. But that careful wording could not control the emotion already attached to the story. Queen Elizabeth's memory remained deeply tied to Balmoral, while Charles, Anne, and Camilla Each represented a different relationship with the past. The public saw more than keys. They saw a family struggling over what should be protected and who had the right to decide. Anne felt increasingly uneasy as praise gathered around her. She had been right to stop changes that were moving too quickly. But after entering the preserved room with Charles, the princess knew the story was not as simple as protector versus destroyer. She did not want her grief turned into a weapon against another member of the family, especially now that she understood how incomplete the information behind Camilla's decision had been. Camilla felt the opposite pressure. She watched herself being cast as the woman who had tried to lock away the late queen's memory, even though her original concern had centered on security, maintenance, and controlled access. The queen consort could accept that she had moved too far, but the public judgment carried an older wound. Once again, her actions were being measured against a royal past she could never enter and could never replace. One fictional morning newspaper captured the mood with 3 words across its front page: "Anne holds the keys." Beneath the headline sat Balmoral's gates and a close image of the princess, while television presenters repeatedly held up the edition and argued over what those keys now symbolized. The image spread because it reduced a complicated family dispute into one powerful idea: Anne guarding her mother's legacy. Palace aides soon noticed an unexpected consequence. The controversy had created pressure for a formal preservation policy governing historically sensitive private royal spaces, a clear set of rules about who could alter, access, catalog, or repurpose rooms carrying major family significance. Suddenly, the dispute offered Charles a way to prevent the same wound from opening again. Charles chose not to let that policy become another victory for one side. What began with a locked door would end with a decision, not about who had won, but about how the family intended to live with the memories neither Anne nor Camilla could escape. In the end, nobody was expelled from Balmoral. Nobody surrendered their place within the family, and the castle did not become the trophy of a winner. But something important had changed. Anne's seizure of the keys forced a private disagreement into the open, and made Charles confront an issue the family had postponed: how to preserve the emotional world of the late queen without turning her memory into a weapon against the living. Charles made the final arrangement carefully. Historically sensitive suites would remain protected, but no future change could be made through an informal household instruction alone. The family preservation arrangement meant that rooms carrying deep personal importance would be managed through direct consultation before access or use could change. The king was not choosing his sister over his wife. He was creating a boundary strong enough to protect memory without freezing Balmoral in grief. Anne returned the temporary keyring to the royal security custodian after receiving an approved family access set of her own. The princess did it without triumph because she understood what the gesture proved. She had never wanted permanent control. She had wanted time, consultation, and respect for spaces still connected to Queen Elizabeth. And she could admit something else. Camilla had not been trying to erase her mother. The mistake had been moving too quickly through emotions that had never been properly explained. Camilla faced that truth privately with Charles. She acknowledged that her interpretation of the review had gone too far, and told him she would not seek another change to the preserved suites without Anne being consulted. The queen consort did not surrender her place in the family, but she accepted that belonging could not mean rewriting every boundary that existed before her. Anne met Camilla quietly before they left Balmoral. She placed one duplicate key on the table between them and explained which family room it opened. Then the princess said that someday they should open that room together, rather than fight over it separately. Camilla accepted the key. There was no dramatic embrace, no sudden friendship, and no attempt to pretend the wound had never existed. But the queen consort understood the offer for what it was. Not surrender, but recognition. That became the final verdict. Anne had protected the past without claiming ownership of it, while Camilla kept her place without needing to replace what came before. The keys returned where they belonged. The sweets remained protected, and Balmoral gained a boundary everyone finally understood. Elizabeth's memory would be honored, but it would no longer divide the living. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.